أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. Assalamu alaikum dear students. I wish all of you will be doing fine and all of your loved ones would be enjoying great health. So proceeding with our previous lecture discussion, today I would like to cover some of the part of the previous lecture which I couldn't discuss because of the limited time available for the lecture. So I would like to cover that part of our previous lecture regarding the various concepts which are being discussed in the international relations, and I would bring another very significant concept which is heavily discussed in the study of international relations all around the globe, and that is the concept of power. So before talking about the concept of power, or before we start having discussion about the various dimensions of the concept of power in international relations, first I would like to talk about the concept which I couldn't complete in our previous lecture, and that is the concept of polarity. Being a student of political science, you might be familiar with this very concept of polarity, and now I would like to have a brief discussion about this very concept. So this concept of polarity is considered as one of the key concepts of international relations, and in a simple words, like we can say that polarity is the various ways in which the power is distributed throughout the world or region, how the world is structured in terms of power, that is known as the polarity. And there are many types of there are many variants, different variants of polarity, which are discussed in both political science and international relations. So now we will talk about the different types of polarity in international relations. The first one is, which we will talk about, is unipolarity, and then we will proceed with the concept of bipolarity, and then multipolarity, and finally we will talk about non-polarity. So first of all, we will talk about the concept or one of the types of polarity, which is unipolarity. So as it is very much clear with the literal meaning of this very word unipolarity, the system in which one state possesses the most political power and most political influence in the international system, that is known as a unipolarity or unipolar system. We can take the example of the United States of America after the end of the Cold War, when it emerged as a single hegemon, and that system after the Cold War is considered as one of the best examples of the unipolar world, in which the United States of America influence the, like, establish its political influence in almost all around the world. So talking about bipolarity, As we can conceive from the very word bipolarity that it is a system in which more than one state, but not more than two, in which actually two powers, two states possess or have political influence in the international system. That is called bipolar world. The best example of this type of polarity is the Cold War era, in which the whole world got divided into two blocks. One block was led by the former Soviet Union, the Eastern Bloc led by the former Soviet Union, and the Western Bloc was led by the United States of America. And these two powers established their political control and influence in their respective blocks. So the structure of the world during Cold War era was a bipolar world, or it was a bipolarity. And you can see the map of the world, and you can see that in that map the different regions have been colored differently to demarcate the influence of two great powers of that time having their political influence in different parts of the world. So now we will talk about the multipolarity. It is a system in which more than two powers, or in which several powers have a considerable degree of political influence in the affairs of the international system. So this sort of system is known as a multipolar world or multipolar structure. And the when we talk about having an example of this sort of system, we can say that the system after the First World War was one of the best examples of the multipolar world, in which different powers established their political influence or control in different parts of the world. And that system was categorized as a multipolar world. So now finally we will talk about the last type of polarity, that is the non-polarity. And it is a system in which no state possesses the most political influence. So it is a system in which not a particular country, not a single particular country enjoys the most political influence in the affairs of the international system. So while talking about the example of this sort of polarity, it is like some thinkers around the globe believe that the world is heading towards this, but still it is debatable, because the current state of affair demonstrates demonstrates that maybe the Cold War is back again, and this time it's been contested between China and the United States of America, rather than the Russia, the inheritor of the former Soviet Union, and the United States of America. So these were the different types of polarity which we were discussing, and now we will talk about one of the most significant concepts of international relation, and that is the concept of power. We will have a thorough discussion about this very concept because it is very significant as far as the study of international relation is concerned. So we would probably take a couple of lectures to cover all the various dimensions of power. Okay, first of all, we will talk about the definition of power, and this concept of power invites lot of ambiguity as well, because to different people they define power in a different way. So we would try to like cover all the various dimensions of power in our today's discussion, and we will proceed further with the various types of power as well in the next lecture. So power, we would start with the basic definition of power in the international relations. So generally power is considered as the ability to influence others, like in literal sense. But when we talk about the definition of power in political science or international relations, this is one of the essentially contested concepts in the study of international relations. This is one of the definitions given by the Penguin Dictionary of International Relations. So it is also like the concept of power is one of the most troublesome in the field of international relations. This is the definition given by Robert Gilpin. He is known as one of the key figures when we talk about the concept of power, and his works are considered like the key uh, like this he his ideas relating to the concept of power are considered very valuable in the field of international relations. According to Brian C. Schmidt, he says power, like a host of other important concepts in IR, is an essentially contested concept. It means quite different things to different people. So as I just mentioned few moments ago that concept of power in the field of international relation is a contested one. It means mm, to different people, it means different things to different people. So there is hardly a consensus on the definition of power in the field of international relation. So this shows the nature of the concept of power in the international relations. So overall we can say that at its simplest, power in interstate relations may be defined as the state's ability to control or at least influence other state or the outcome of events. So generally speaking, when we talk about the concept of power in the international relations, it is considered as the ability of one state to influence or affect the other states or the outcome of events. So now we will talk about after having the literal the definition of concept of power in international relations. Now we will talk about the various dimensions which are associated with the concept of power. So there are two sorts of dimensions of power which are usually discussed in the international relations, that is the internal dimension of power and the external dimension of power. So first we will talk about the internal dimension of power. It corresponds to the dictionary definition of power as a capacity for action. So a state is powerful to the extent that it is insulated from the outside influence or coercion in the formulation and implementation of a policy. A common synonym for the internal dimension of power is autonomy. So we can conceive from this very internal dimension of like the statement of internal dimension of power, that it should be insulated from the external influence, or it should be protected from the external interference. It is also related to the very concept of sovereignty which we discussed in our previous lecture, that and that had that concept of sovereignty, the Westphalian sovereignty, has been incorporated into the Charter of the United Nations as well, that ensures that a state is not allowed or authorized to interfere in the affairs of the other state. So the state should be insulated from the outside influence or coercion in the formulation and implementation of policy. So this internal dimension of power is also associated with the Westphalian concept of sovereignty, that no state is allowed to interfere in the internal affairs of the other country. And the when we talk about the absolute sort of autonomy of the state's power in the international concept, that is something which is almost missing. So because of the globalized nature of the world, states policies are affected from the outsiders in so many ways. So this dimension of power is very much significant when we talk about the concept of power in international relations, and it carries a lot of significance. Now we will talk about the other dimension of power, that is the external dimension of power, and it corresponds to the dictionary definition of power as a capacity to control the behavior of others. So to that means to enforce compliance. Such influence need not be actively exercised, rather it need only be acknowledged by others implicitly or explicitly to be effective. It also needs not to be exercised with conscious intent. The behavior of others can be influenced simply as a byproduct of powerful acts. So this external dimension of power involves the state's capacity to control the behavior of others. That internal dimension was about like states autonomy not to be not to be challenged by the external players or external actors, or not to be exercised, not to be challenged from the outside. And this external definition dimension of power is like it's a sort of capacity of the state to control the behavior of other states, in which one state tries to control the behavior of other states, not in and it is not always be acknowledged by other implicitly or explicitly, and it should not be exercised with conscious intent, rather it can be unconsciously implemented by a state as a byproduct of powerful acts. So these two internal and external dimensions are quite the opposite of each other. Now we will talk about the distinction of power. The structural power confers the power to decide how things shall be done, the power to shape frameworks with which states relate to one another, relate to people, or relate to corporate enterprises. So, this structural aspect of power has been gaining a lot of significance in the modern, the contemporary era, because of its rising significance or because of its increasing value in the international system. And it invites so many players, like major powers, to decide how things should be done, and how to structure, or how to shape the frameworks within which states relate to one another, or states relate to the people in different countries around the globe, or to relate, or to how to cooperate with the business enterprises. So because of the extensive activity of state, the structural power has come to immense significance in the concept in international relations. Now we will talk about the relative power. It is another dimension of power. It is more or less if one party is also determining the surrounding structure of the relationship. As we just mentioned in our previous slide, that the structural power is of immense value, because not only one player but more than one actor tries to shape the structure, try to shape the networks, that how states should relate to each other, or how states should relate to the people and different enterprises. So the power is relative in this very concept, and it is when one party like uh, tries to determine the surrounding structure of the relationship, and other party also comes into the picture, then the power becomes relative. And now we will talk about four separate but related structures of power in international relations, which are heavily discussed in the study of power in international relations. The first one is the knowledge structure. It refers to the power to influence the ideas of others. This through this structure, through this knowledge power, the power to influence, the power is exercised to influence the ideas of the others. And in the financial structure, it refers to the power to restrict or facilitate their access to the credit or to the markets. So and in the security structure, it refers to shaping their prospect for security. And finally, the production structure affects their chances of a better life as producers and as consumers. So these are the four various structures of power that comes into play when we talk about the concept of relative power or structural power. So we would not dig deep into this discussion, and because we would try to focus primarily more on the various types of power like hard power, soft power, and smart power. And by having discussion about the various dimensions of power, we are trying to set a foundation for having a better discussion or better discussion about the upcoming topics related to this concept of power. So this on this page we can also see some of the reasons behind the controversy which is associated with the concept of power. So we will briefly have an overlook at these three dimensions or the reasons why the concept of power is controversial and highly debated. The first one is that the concept of power is primitive in a specific sense that its meaning cannot be elucidated by reference to nations whose meanings, other notions whose meanings is less controversial than its own. Mean like truth is another such primitive concept. Like power, truth is another such primitive concept. The second reason is that the concept of power is essentially contested. We already have discussed about that in the very first definitions we came up with at the start of our lecture, that it is highly contested. In other words, it cannot be disconnected from what we commonly call the value assumption of the person making the judgment. Third, the contestedness of power, the fact that what counts as power and being powerful is controversial matters. For as Stefano Guzzini argues, it has performative role in our discourse and more particularly our political discourse. How we conceive of power makes a difference to how we think and act in general and more particularly in particular context. So it is taken in differently by different meaning, and how we conceive, how we think of power is quite different from how we act in general and particularly in the political context. So because of this dichotomy, because of this difference, it this concept of power becomes wholly contested in the study of international relations. So we would take a minute to talk about the tradition of power, and then we would try to summarize our today's discussion. According to David Baldwin, there are two dominant traditions of power analysis in international relations. The first one is in terms of elements of national power approach, which depicts power as resources, and the second one is the relational power approach, which depicts power as an actual or potential relationship. So, according to the national power approach, proponents of this element of national power approach equates power with possession of specific resources. All of the important resources that a state possesses are typically combined in some fashion to determine its overall aggregate power. So these resources that are most often used as an indicator of national power, these elements include the level of military expenditure, how much a country spends on its military modernization or military advancement, the GDP growth of a country, the size of the armed forces, and the size of the territory and population is also considered as the one of the key elements of the national power. And we can see that China last year invested the biggest military, like invested in military budget, that was the amount was 1.11 trillion dollars, US dollars. And that is the all-time high investment in all around the world by a one country. Now we will talk about the relational power approach. This approach was championed by behavioral oriented political scientists during the 50s and 60s. Robert Dahl, according to Robert Dahl, who was an influential advocate of relational concept of power, according to him, A has power over B to the extent that he can get B to do something that B would not do otherwise. So the fundamental to the relational concept of power is the ability to demonstrate a change in the outcomes. Power as a set of material resources is deemed to be less important than the actual ability of actor A to change the behavior of actor B.